Welcome back to the I Am More Than podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Wessel. I'm a former Miss Arizona USA professional model and founder of More Than Inc. One of our company pillars is social issues, and I, for one, refuse to turn a blind eye to what's happening in our country. There's no doubt our world is hurting so badly right now, and with so many public injustices happening to people of color, it's easy to feel helpless. But now more than ever, it's vital to realize that we all have a responsibility to speak up against the racism that exists in our society. Staying silent is the worst thing that we could be doing right now, but it's also important to listen and learn so that we can become better allies and better friends. I wanted to have a raw, educational, and honest conversation about race so that I can personally learn and inspire my listeners to do the same. So lean into this conversation. It's an important one. I'm honored to have someone I greatly respect on the podcast and excited to introduce you to my friend, Khaleeqa Rouse. Welcome to the I Am More Than podcast, Khaleeqa. I'm so excited to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. Thank you for having me, Jordan.
Of course. And you and I had met through church back in New York, where I miss so much. But I've always just really had a high level of respect for you because I admire your faith and your selflessness and your heart for people. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come and have this conversation with me. You didn't have to, and I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Jordan. You're such a light, and that means so much coming from you. I remember when I met you, I'm like, oh my God, this girl is a ray of sunshine. So you inspire
Oh
me
my
right
God.
back.
Well, you just made my whole day. So thank you very much. Well, one of the reasons that I had launched this podcast was not only to entertain and inspire, but also to educate our listeners, educate myself. And in the past, I feel like I've been fearful to speak out about race because I didn't want to risk saying the wrong thing, asking a stupid question, or offending someone. And I'm realizing that not saying anything is far worse. So I wanted to have a transparent conversation that was just raw and honest and constructive about race. And the goal is to learn how I can become a better ally and a better friend. And I really appreciate your willingness to help me learn.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your willingness to have the conversation. I work in the nonprofit field and I work in ministry, and you know, I'm prefacing this by I'm not an expert, but I will speak to my own personal experience and then just things that I've learned. And I think it's important for your listeners to understand that just because I'm Black doesn't mean I'm an expert, but I can share my experience and I can help another person find empathy. And I think that that's the heart behind what you're trying to do. So it's amazing.
Absolutely. And I really believe that our perspective comes from our experiences. And in order to understand someone else's perspective, like it's really vital to listen just to what they've been through. And I think listen is the key word here because I want to listen without any judgment, listen with the intention to learn. And I'm encouraging anybody that's tuning into this conversation to do the exact same thing because you said you're not an expert. I'm not pretending to be any kind of an expert. I just want to have a conversation with my girlfriend about how we can all be better. So you did mention you work in ministry, and I wanted our audience to get to know you a little bit better. So can you tell us a little bit about you and about your background?
Sure. So professionally, I work as a community manager overseeing outreach for Hillsong East Coast. And I basically oversee how our church cares for the community in four different states, from everything from homeless outreach to we're working with mental health initiatives to food insecurity and food distribution. So, any way that you would think a church does outreach, I help to orchestrate plans and objectives and all these things, initiatives to help people in those communities. And my background is actually very different. I went to school for finance and global business, and I have an MBA. And so I basically think I'm like a professional problem solver. A very business background, but it's been amazing to see the marriage between that very specialized and business background and how it comes into like scaling good and helping people because it is so much more effective when you bring both of those together. And so before I came into this job, I worked as an executive director for a nonprofit in an urban district in New Jersey. And that was amazing. I learned a lot. I got to run pretty much my own shop for 10 years and have a staff and work with a lot of different people, a lot of different people from different backgrounds. Made a lot of mistakes, but I also made a lot of change. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about where I've come professionally. So that's been really amazing.
I love that you said a professional problem solver. We need more of you. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I know you're very involved in the community. Like you said, you are over 4 states now, kind of overseeing people of all different types of backgrounds. And I'm sure you've seen up close a lot of different experiences, a lot of different struggles that people are dealing with. And do you see that racism is affecting all the different types of people that you are helping with outreach?
Yeah, 100%. I think that a lot of times when it comes to this conversation, we think personal prejudice and personal racism that happens to us or people that we know, and that is very, very real. But when you talk about racism and the differences between racism and prejudice, racism has the element where prejudice meets power. And so the power that is involved in racism is that you have structures and systems that have historically been legislated to suppress certain people groups. And so when you're talking about doing outreach, usually a lot of my work is looking to fill the gaps in the ways that systems have oppressed people based off the color of their skin. And so you have that element which we're fighting to remedy and help, which is like a systems problem. But then on top of that, you have the personal problem. So knowing that a person of color is going to walk into an agency for help and they're probably going to be treated very differently than a person who is white. And so, how do you advocate for them? How do you teach people how to speak out? How do you make people feel like they're human beings? And I remember when I took over my last job, which had been that organization had been around for 40 years. And I had to deal with a lot of those mindsets around race, just because a lot of my staff was white and they hadn't really been in experience with people of color, or if they had been, they weren't treating them correctly. And a lot of people in that community were so used to being dismissed, unheard, and just treated very poorly. And I remember one time I had the staff meeting and I said, here's what we're not going to do when someone comes into our building. Here you're going to look somebody in the eye. You're not going to assume that I work with children, so you're not going to assume that they're a bad parent. You're going to talk to them as if it's a collaboration. And so there were things that I had to just be very aware of to um, shift culture around how people in that community were being treated. And so, yeah, I definitely experienced that personally, but then also on a bigger scale through the systems that I'm working within.
Wow. And I had seen this quote come out yesterday from Will Smith, and he was saying racism isn't getting worse, it's getting filmed. And that opened my eyes to the same point of what you were just talking about, that you're seeing it systemically in multiple different organizations, and you're having to educate grown adults on, even if they're not trying to have any type of racism in their language or in their actions, that it can be there and that there's room for growth. Do you ever find that people are not willing to grow, not willing to learn, or are you surprised that almost everybody is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most people, to be honest, aren't. Initially, I think that within the past month, when we've saw just such a public injustice happen, and all of us saw it, and we're all in quarantine, so more people are tuned into their phones now. I've actually seen people shift a lot more than I thought that they would. But I think the issue often is it's uncomfortable. So people aren't used to kind of like stewing and being uncomfortable about something that they may have, been guilty of in the past, or they're trying to shift their perspectives. Like, no one wants to be labeled a racist, but you can actually work through that and work past that. And I heard something the other day that said, this one was describing racism and racistness as a sin, just as anything else. So if you are a glutton and someone says, hey, you're a glutton, and you start to work through that and you change that, you don't live in that identity, you work past that. And so just because someone might have done that in the past doesn't mean that it's who their identity is or who they'll always be. It's a matter of working through that. And I think having that understanding when you approach these conversations is just going to be really helpful in not letting the lament and hurt overtake you, but just like acknowledging it, having deep empathy, and working on yourself and your own heart when it comes to when it comes to experiencing the narratives of people of color and what they're saying.
Absolutely. And I think that the only way we can really do that is being willing to put our egos aside and learn and have these conversations. And like you said, although it may be uncomfortable, I think it's uncomfortable because in 2020, we shouldn't have to have these conversations. I think a lot of people think we should be further along, and we're embarrassed that we're not. And that's not an excuse not to educate yourself so that we can hopefully educate the next generation. So we don't have to continue fighting the same fight. And I know that it is very public right now, and a lot of people are talking, a lot of people are open to learning, but a lot of people are defensive as well. And that's where I really want to break through that defensiveness and make it realize like this should be a people problem. And it's not fair to put it off on one group of people. And I also think that this idea of faith when it comes to racism, I've seen a lot of people that I respect in our Christian community, a lot of our pastors at Hillsong and other churches that I follow their pastors being very outspoken about it, which is really encouraging to me. But I also realize that this issue has been going on for a long time, and there's a lot of faith leaders that have not spoken out about it. And I'm curious what your take on it is why do people weaponize faith in the face of injustice instead of speaking out about it? Why do you think that is?
I think it kind of goes back to what I said before. It's just very, very uncomfortable. And historically, especially within the Christian faith tradition, it's being used as a way of suppression. So, when Black people came to this country as slaves, we weren't allowed to attend church services. We weren't allowed to read the Bible. We weren't allowed to do any of these things. And so they use the Bible as a way of justifying our suppression and the horrific acts that were happening. And I think through the years that mindset has just morphed into other things. We've become more unified as a church, but I think the truth of the history of what has happened within the faith tradition is still extremely uncomfortable. And so sometimes people think it's better just to not do anything or not say anything because it's uncomfortable. And especially, you said something at the beginning of this, you were afraid to talk about it because you didn't want to say the wrong thing. And so I think that is also very telling of what happens, like, publicly with a lot of faith leaders. They're afraid to say the wrong thing. And then it takes a deep dive into your own heart of like, wow, maybe I said this comment before and I just feel horrible, like ruminating on just horrible things that people have done personally when it comes to being racist towards another race is really a hard truth to sit with, because then they're like, well, am I reconciled from this? Am I able to preach about this if I myself have been guilty of perpetrating racism to another person? And so I think it's very layered and mixed. I think also we see a lot of times certain stances on race being assigned to like a political party, which is also very hurtful as well. It's become, very racism isn't bipartisan. It just looks different when it comes to that, and so faith leaders often don't want to speak out because of that. But I think it's a very layered issue on why people don't want to do it. I don't think it's just one thing, but I think it's a combination of all of those things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And you had made a very interesting comment about how sometimes racism is attached to a political party. Why is that?
Um, I think overt racism the way that we understand it, like publicly when bad things happen. I think that, yeah, that's because we have legislation that maybe feeds into one type of party's understanding of racism. Like, we all understand racism as what happened in these public acts of shooting. And so if one party is leaning more towards supporting police who are perpetrating these injustices, then we're going to link those actions to that party. But we found, recently in the news, especially with the incident in Central Park with the woman who was falsely accusing a man of attacking her, and called 911, that looks very different for maybe another political persuasion. So I think it exists on both sides, but it just looks different on both sides. And so that's why it's important to have these conversations to begin to unpack some of that stuff, and just unpack and understand what it truly looks like. I think that will help us to just have a clearer conversation and understand that racism it's bipartisan. It's not just one particular party, it's both.
Interesting. And you had brought up the woman in Central Park. And I
Hmm.
think that anybody that sees what she actually did, it's horrendous. And thank God it was caught on tape. So it's opening people's eyes that even when she came out afterwards and said she's not a racist, and it's tough because that's the first thing that somebody wants to say when they're being caught doing something that is racist. And that's where my question comes from, the difference between racism and racial bias. Do you believe that there's two different things? Can somebody be an unconscious racist?
That's a very good question. I personally don't think that there's any difference between racist and racial bias. I think that they're both the same. I think it's just that we, obviously for good reason, being called a racist, nobody wants to. That's like the worst thing anybody could be called, especially in our society today and the way that we operate. But like I said, it's just like any other sin. So it's just like being called, a murderer or something like that, or a thief. You don't have to stay there. It's what happened, and there's reconciliation that can come. And so I think that people can unconsciously be racist too. It doesn't, what she did, and even though she said she wasn't, her actions were. And so even if she's unpacking in her own identity, like, hey, why did I do that? Why did I feel threatened when this man uh just told me to obey the law? What inside of me made me want to do that? What
Yeah.
beliefs am I carrying? What perspective do I have of the world that made me weaponize my call to 911 as a retaliation against this person? Just because she wasn't aware that she was like that doesn't mean that it didn't exist.
I really like how you said that. And I think that, like you said, it is a sin and there's room for growth, but you have to be able to identify that there is a problem. And I'm realizing that there's a systemic problem, and it's a conversation that not only needs to be had amongst us adults, but it's a conversation that needs to happen with the next generation. And I've been trying to do some of my own self-evaluation on how can I be better? How can I spark this conversation in a constructive way? How can we talk to younger folks about what's happening, younger folks that are scared and want to make a change? How do you think it's constructive to talk to the younger generation about what they're seeing on social media and what they're seeing on the news?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a twofold answer, and I was going to address some of this on my social media account as I was trying to just unpack what's happening. But I think specifically for Black people, we really don't get the luxury to go through a phase of healing when things like this happen. We have to go straight into doing the work in social justice. And so even just saying, hey, I need a moment, or I'm actually having trauma, or I like putting a name to that, I think is important for Black people, especially who are listening to this, to say, hey, I'm not okay. Like, I can't talk about this. I have to like take a moment. I need to process. I need to do X, Y, and Z. I think that that is a sign of resistance, and it's showing like, hey, I recognize that my trauma is important and it deserves a place to be dealt with. And I think for people who aren't of color, what the question, especially when national tragedies like this happen right away, is what you're doing is how can I listen? And specifically asking a person of color in your life or whoever's listening's life, what is it like to be Black in America? And just listening and preparing your own heart to receive what you hear back. Because it's very eye opening, and really leaning in and hearing that person's experience is not only educating yourself without asking to be educated, but it's also creating empathy and space for the person who is saying this to heal, and maybe putting words to some of the things that they've been afraid to say, especially if they're in a diverse space. Just because there's diversity doesn't mean there's equality. And so people of color aren't always, they're on edge. Like, we're on edge a lot of times because we don't want someone to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, because we have to protect our own hearts. And so I think if you can teach the next generation, if you're a person of color, it's okay to have trauma. It's okay to heal. It's okay to take space for that. And the next generation of white people saying, hey, you can learn to listen well, you can learn to have empathy, and you can learn to ask questions of the people in your life. I think that's powerful. And then both sides can collectively work on equality. Like, we can collectively sign petitions and protest and make calls to our politicians and the people who represent us in government. I think we can all work on that piece together.
Definitely. And I do want to ask, because you had done a video not too long ago about collective grief, and I felt very convicted when you said that grief looks different for everybody. And I think that that's a little bit of what you were just touching on too, that it needs to be okay, that you shouldn't have to answer to all these questions, and you should be able to take that time to deal with the fact that traumatic things are happening right now, and not everybody knows how to handle it. And I do want to ask the very straightforward question that you had just said. What is it like for you being Black in America?
Well, I appreciate you for asking me. I think being Black in America, I didn't realize the tension that I held about my experience until I went to Africa when that wasn't there. So I had a trip to Uganda back in 2017. And it was the first time I was in a society where everybody looked like me. And so I literally, like, I physically, like, released. I didn't even realize I was holding around this tightness. And so the tightness, which I can now name, was just this constant awareness of my Blackness and the uncomfortability that sometimes it gives to other people. So for me, just walking into a store, it's a normal, for most people, it's a normal thing, but I'm constantly aware of, like, how do I look? How am I speaking? Am I making the sales clerk feel uncomfortable because of my Blackness? Or is she gonna assume that I'm trying to steal something? Or always just being super small and docile and, like, aware and articulate and all of these things so that other white people feel comfortable, or so that I'm not attacked, or I've been getting pulled over a lot more in the town that I live in. And so just that constant fear when I see a cop car, it's like my blood pressure raises. And, like, what am I going to do? What is that going to look like? Or just being out with friends in a diverse group of people. What Sometimes a racist joke, I mean, it's happened to me so many times, like a racist joke or a microaggression will come up, and I have to, like, literally, I'm having a good time and I'm like, okay, now do I address this? Like, what do I say? I don't want to make it uncomfortable for other people. Do I do something later? Or even within a church setting, so many people mean well, and I have a great pastor that advocates for social justice for Black people. But sometimes I worry, like, are they going to say the right thing? Am I going to have to fight this fight, or am I going to have to do this? So I think just from every single aspect of my life, it's just kind of like on edge a bit, to a point where I think for most Black people, including myself, it's just gone so deep within you that it's just a part of your subconscious. And I didn't realize that until I went to Africa. So yeah, that's the long and short of that answer.
Wow. Well, I know I can't speak on behalf of anybody else. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you have to feel that way. It's not right. You shouldn't have to. I don't know the answer on how to change that.
Mhm.
And I don't think anybody does. But I want to know, how do I become a better ally? How do I try to spark any bit of change with any bit of privilege or platform or anything that I have? What can I be doing better to be a better ally
Yeah.
and a better friend, quite
Yeah.
frankly?
When national tragedies happen that really kick up the dust around the racial injustices that are happening in our country, there are three aspects to this. The first aspect is healing, which I've touched on a little bit with empathy and just being able to express how people of color are feeling. Then there's equality, which is social justice and being able to use your voice, your privilege, and platform to affect change. And then there's reconciliation. So, doing the hard work of creating inclusive communities and bridging the gap between people of color and white people together and creating environments that are awesome. And so I think that if you see it as those three things, then from healing perspective, you can just simply ask the people in your life, how is it being Black in America, and just listen, actively listen, resist the urge to change, say anything, resist the urge to want to find a solution really quickly, just listen. And like you said, I'm sorry, I don't have the answers, but through that listening, you create just empathy, healing, so many different things. From the equality standpoint, I think that you can really call it out when you see injustice, call it out in your life when you see people around you who are participating in racism or saying things that are not okay. And protesting, being a part of initiatives online, using your platform to highlight it. I think those are things that publicly we can do to create equality, and especially in more nuanced ways. Like, if you Google microaggressions against people of color, you see just so many things that people say and do, and many times they're unaware of it. But little things like that, especially within the workplace, if you can call it out, educate yourself, and understand what's happening, then I think that that helps tremendously. And then when it comes to the reconciliation, the cool thing is that, we as Christians have faith in the biggest reconciler of them all, which is Jesus. And I believe that through prayer, he's able to help us facilitate communities that are going to look and sound like what heaven looks and sounds like. So it's a diverse group of people from all different backgrounds. So I think creating space for that to happen and understanding our own, point of view is not always the right point of view, and opening ourselves up to different languages, cultures, foods, like all sorts of cool, amazing things that you can open yourself up to, just to be aware that it exists, and that, like, hey, I want to celebrate other cultures. And I think the cool thing is that our church is moving in that direction when it comes to reconciliation piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I learned so much personally even through that. And I love that you're at the forefront of really making a change, not only just in our church, but in our overall community. I mean, what you're leading through with Hillsong City Hope right now is you have outreach to reach countless people and bring them to Christ. And faith isn't something that I've really talked about on this podcast yet, which
Mhm.
is going to be developing. And I'm really glad that we're able to cover two very important topics here, because I think that when you are a person of faith, you can't stand by and watch this sin take place and not speak up. I
Mhm.
think that there's so much that we can be doing simply by using our voice and by educating people that this is not what Christ would be doing. Like, Christ surrounded himself around people of all different backgrounds. And it is not our right to judge anybody for any reason, especially because of the color of their skin. So when you're doing outreach through City Hope, are you working with people that don't know faith and are struggling with faith, or what has your experience been like that, exposing the community that you're working with to what you believe in?
Yeah, I mean, definitely a lot of people who don't know Christ, which I think even through the pandemic has been really powerful. But I think one of the most powerful things that we can do, especially in that situation, is that our kindness through the generosity I'm able to facilitate is actually showing people tangibly the love of God. And so it's way more powerful than sitting down with someone and maybe unpacking the gospel of Christ for them to just receive something and be like, wow, this is God. Like when they're in a hopeless situation and like the church has come alongside and help with a utility bill or help, with someone's rent or got food for them or, we've been working with a lot of essential workers. And so we showed up with snack packs and like an encouraging note. And I mean, it just goes so far. And so that to me is just like, that piques the curiosity and then they begin to unpack and engage. And, you know, I love the verse in scripture where it says, some of us are sowers, some of us are harvesters, and some of us water it. And so it's this collective process of which we're bringing people through to faith. And so sometimes I don't know what part of the process I am when we go out and we're generous to the community. Sometimes we're going to harvest and people will come on in, or sometimes we're just planting the seed. But I think this tangible act of generosity is just so powerful, and it's just a demonstration of the love of God, which I think is awesome.
I love that. And that was leading into my next question, as I was going to ask, what are some tangible actions that our listeners can do right now to actually make a change, not only within themselves, but also within their communities?
Yeah, I think, there's been some really powerful ways that online people are engaging, especially around the equality part of it. So making sure that you're making yourself aware of which lawmakers are supporting laws that actually suppress other people groups, and actively engaging with them, whether signing a petition or joining a protest. I think that that is very powerful. And historically, that's been a way that we've made change in our country. Having the difficult conversations with people in your life, maybe, there's an aunt or an uncle or cousin or somebody that is maybe their heart isn't where it should be, or they have a really skewed perspective on this, and maybe just providing resources or doing it together, saying, hey, like I'm taking this digital course on, racial bias, would you want to join me? What are your thoughts on it? And then for people in your life, especially if you're listening to this and you're a Black person and you're like, what, this is too much, reaching out to other Black people and saying, hey, like, I'm not okay. Can we just talk? Can we pray together? Can we go and like have a Zoom coffee or something? And I just want to share with you my emotions and my feelings, or seeking out therapy to deal with some of the trauma. And then if you're a white person saying, asking that question that you asked me, what is it like to be Black in America, and being a listening ear? And that's it.
Wow. Well, I'm really grateful that you took the time to come on here, and I learned so much through you. I think you're such an incredible person, and you've changed so many people's lives. And I think that you're going to help a lot of people spark constructive dialogue through this. And I'm really proud that I can call you a friend, and I'm proud that I can be in this journey with you and in this fight with you. So thank you for taking the time. And I know you have a video coming out as well that you're going to be putting on your social channels. Where can everybody find you?
Sure. Thank you so much for the kind words first. You really make my day.
Of
Appreciate you saying that.
course.
Yeah, I am online as Khaleeqa Rouse. So KHALEEQAROUSE. And that's on Instagram. And I'm just going to post something on my IGTV, really unpacking what I mentioned around the difference between healing, equality, and reconciliation. And what is the question that we can ask, which I shared with you also.
Absolutely. And there's so many other aspects to you that I would love to get in on. So I need to bring you back on another podcast episode, because you have an unbelievable page filled with health and wellness and mental health. And you've had so many experiences in different fields that I would love to pick your brain on at a later time. So we will definitely be seeing you back on this podcast in just a little bit.
Thank you, Jordan.
I hope you got just as much out of this episode as I did and learned something through this open and honest conversation. Please share this episode. Share with your family and friends, the younger generation and the older generation. We need to continue having conversations like this. It's important that we listen and learn from each other and work together to spark real change. In the show notes, we've listed ways that you can get involved online if you'd like to take action in that way. Remember, we are so much more than black and white. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.